We would like to express our deepest gratitude to all those who contributed to the successful completion of this case study. First and foremost, we extend our sincere appreciation to the University President, Maria Carla A. Ototorena, RN, PhD, whose exemplary leadership and commitment to quality education continue to inspire students to strive for excellence. We also convey our heartfelt gratitude to our Dean, Rubel Marcia Ho Alabar, RN, MAN, TSCN, for her guidance, unwavering support, and dedication to providing the opportunities and resources necessary to enrich our academic learning. We are deeply grateful to our professors, whose knowledge, expertise, and encouragement guided us throughout the development of these studies. Their dedication and mentorship played a vital role in shaping our understanding and professional growth. Our profound appreciation is extended to our client, whose trust, cooperation, and willingness to participate made this case study possible. The client openness significantly contributed to the completeness and depth of this work. We also sincerely thank our family and friends for their continuous support, understanding, and motivation. Their encouragement served as a constant source of strength throughout this academic journey. Above all, we offer our greatest gratitude to the beloved Almighty, whose grace, wisdom, and strength guided us through every step of this endeavor. Without His blessings, the successful completion of this work would not have been possible.
So, for the abstract of this case study, nutrition and dietary function in a closed manner. Nutrition supplies the body with the essential nutrients required, while dietary ensures to set parameters for appropriate food and fluid intake. In hospitals, one commonly prescribed therapeutic diet is the clear liquid diet. This case study, entitled A Case Study on Clear Liquid Diet, Internal Brain Hemorrhage Patient, examines the nutritional assessment and dietary management of a 32-year-old male with hypertension who underwent craniotomy upon receiving a diagnosis of internal brain hemorrhage in the left hemisphere of the brain. Post-surgery, the patient was non-ambulatory and did not possess the capability of communicating, as well as the patient's right peripheries were paralyzed as observed. After a month in NPO, or nothing per RM state, the patient was prescribed a clear liquid diet as a transitional diet for 1 day. A clear liquid diet is prescribed but not limited to patients who have undergone certain surgical procedures. This study aims to impart knowledge on the concept of a clear liquid diet, as well as to focus on the implementation of the prescribed liquid diet plan, which includes the breakfast, lunch, afternoon snack, dinner, and midnight snack of the patient in this case study, which allowing the GI tract and digestive system to rest associated with this condition. Recommendation includes receiving structured instruction on the gradual reintegration of a balanced diet, hence introducing nutrient-dense foods slowly to restore adequate caloric intake and meet daily nutritional requirements. This study highlights as well the importance of having an appropriate diet plan for post-operative patients to properly restore the liquids, minerals, and other essential nutrients lost during the clinical intervention, which symbolizes the commencement of the beginning phase of the recovery period. Keywords are clear liquid diet, internal brain hemorrhage, hypertension, and nutritional requirements. Now, I'll start discussing the chapter 1 of this case study, which includes the nature of the illness of the patient, the symptoms, the causes, the risk factors, complications, as well as the epidemiology and pathophysiology. So let us begin in understanding brain conditions. So in understanding brain conditions, it's important to recognize that the brain and skull are enclosed spaces. So when blood collects inside these spaces, it has nowhere else to go. Because of this, abnormal blood accumulation may form clots that block blood flow and damage the brain cells. This is why internal bleeding in the brain is considered a medical emergency. Not only can it be life-threatening, but even survivors may experience long-term neurological problems. Now, in our presentation, we will focus on a case of internal bleeding or internal brain hemorrhage affecting the left hemisphere of the brain, mainly associated with high blood pressure or hypertension. Now, to begin, an intracranial hemorrhage, commonly known as a brain bleed, is actually a type of stroke. The brain relies on a continuous supply of oxygen and nutrients, which are carried through blood vessels. When one of these vessels ruptures, blood escapes into areas where it shouldn't be. And as blood accumulates, pressure rises inside the skull, and this pressure prevents oxygen from reaching the cells. Now, if treatment is delayed, these cells may die and cause permanent damage. The term brain bleed sounds simple, but medically, it covers many different situations. The exact location of the bleeding determines the person's symptoms and the treatment they need. Now, generally, bleeding can occur inside the skull only or directly inside the brain tissue. Now, because these two areas serve different functions and structures, each type of bleeding will produce different clinical outcomes. And for this reason, identifying the location is a very important part of the diagnosis. Now, protecting the brain are three layers, so which are called the meninges. So these are the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. So these membranes act like cushions that surround the brain and spinal cord. However, bleeding can also develop within or between those layers. So, aside from bleeding within the brain itself, we also consider the possibility of bleeding in the coverings around it. So, identifying which layer is involved helps guide medical decisions. Now, in this particular case, the bleeding occurs inside the brain tissue itself. This is called the intracerebral hemorrhage. So, because the brain's tissues directly control body functions, any bleeding in these areas may immediately interfere with movement, sensations, language, and consciousness. And this makes intracerebral hemorrhage a very serious form of stroke that requires urgent medical attention. When bleeding affects the left hemisphere, we often observe weakness or paralysis on the right side of the body because the brain controls the opposite side. In addition, the left hemisphere plays a key role in language processing. And because of this, the patient may have difficulty in speaking or understanding words, which is a condition known as aphasia. Vision changes involving the right visual field are also possible. So these symptoms highlights how quickly neurological functions can be affected. Now, this type of intracerebral hemorrhage is considered non-traumatic. Why? Because it happens without a physical injury. Instead, it develops due to internal medical causes like, for example, hypertension, blood vessel weakness, or certain medical conditions. Now, commonly involved structures include the deep brain regions like, for example, the basal ganglia and internal brain lobes. Now, because there is no physical injury, it can occur suddenly, even while the person is resting. So, one of the strongest contributors to intracerebral hemorrhage is uncontrolled high blood pressure. Now, over time, hypertension weakens small arteries inside the brain, and eventually, these fragile vessels can burst, allowing blood to spill into the surrounding tissue. Studies even show that around 83% of intracerebral hemorrhage causes are linked to hypertension. And this clearly emphasizes how essential proper blood pressure management is in preventing stroke. Now, brain injury after hemorrhage occurs in stages. The first stage, known as the primary injury rather, is due directly to the bleeding and the physical pressure caused by blood accumulation. However, damage does not stop there. The presence of blood inside the brain triggers harmful chemical reactions, inflammations, and toxic effects that lead to the secondary injury. The second phase may continue for hours or even days, which is why patients require intensive monitoring even after the initial crisis. Now, long-term uncontrolled hypertension leads to structural changes in the small arteries of the brain, which is a condition known as hypertensive vasculopathy. Now, as time goes on, the walls of these vessels become thin and fragile. So the tiny bulges called microaneurysms may form. And when these fragile points rupture, blood enters the brain tissue and forms a hematoma. So this explains why chronic hypertension is one of the most dangerous risk factors for brain hemorrhage. So let's proceed in the symptoms. So the symptoms a person experiences depends on the location and severity of the bleeding. Now, the common warning signs include the sudden weakness or numbness or paralysis on one side of the body, the severe headache, difficulty swallowing, changes in vision, loss of coordination, and slurred speech could also be signs. In more severe cases, a person may become confused, faint, vomit, or even have seizures. Now, the location of the hemorrhage also influences specific symptoms. Bleeding in the brainstem, for example, may cause abnormal eye movements, irregular breathing, or coma. Now, large hemorrhage in one hemisphere of the brain often lead to hemiparesis, which means weakness or inability to move one side of the body. Now, recognizing these signs quickly is critical. Early detection and immediate medical care can prevent further brain damage and improve the chances of recovery. Now, understanding these symptoms also helps healthcare professionals identify the affected brain area and determine the most urgent treatment. Okay, so now let's proceed to the cause or the causes. So, as stated earlier, as I have mentioned earlier, hypertension or high blood pressure is the most common cause of intracerebral hemorrhage. This is because over time, persistently high blood pressure weakens the small arteries in the brain, particularly the lenticulostriate arteries. So the chronic stress can lead to the formation of tiny aneurysms known as the Charcot-Bouchard microaneurysm, which are small balloon-like bulges in the vessel walls. So when these microaneurysm rupture or when weakened arteries give way, blood quickly spills into the surrounding brain tissue. So this sudden bleeding raises pressure inside the skull and damages nearby brain structures, often resulting in serious neurological deficits. Chronic hypertension also causes structural changes in the arterial walls, such as thickening, the arteriosclerosis, which is the buildup of fatty plaques in artery walls, narrowing and stiffening the arterial walls. We also have the smooth muscle proliferation, changes in smooth muscle proliferation. So this is the abnormal growth and multiplication of smooth muscles cells in the walls of blood vessels. So it contributes to thickening of the vessel wall, narrowing the artery and weakening it, which increases the risk of aneurysm formation or rupture, which further increases the risk of rupture. So hemorrhages caused by these processes are therefore referred to as hypertensive hemorrhages. And because of this, controlling blood pressure is a key preventive measure, even with modern medical advances that have improved survival rates. Preventing the initial rupture remains the most effective way to reduce the occurrences of these life-threatening brain bleeds. Now, for the risk factors for intracerebral hemorrhage. So risk factors for intracerebral hemorrhage can be divided into three main categories: the modifiable, non-modifiable, and other contributing factors. Now, modifiable risk are those that we can influence, like for example, high blood pressure, heavy alcohol use, low levels of cholesterols or triglycerides, and the use of blood thinning medications like anticoagulants and antiplatelets. Now, we also have the non-modifiable factors, and those are factors that we cannot change, which includes advanced age, gender, ethnicity, cerebral amyloid angiopathy, cerebral microbleeds, and kidney problems. And other relevant factors accordingly may include multiple pregnancies, physically demanding jobs, long working hours, and prolonged sleep. Now, among all this, uncontrolled hypertension is the most important and widely reported risk factor of the ICH, or what we call the intracerebral hemorrhage. So, managing blood pressure effectively remains the key to preventing these life-threatening brain bleeds. Although research on lifestyle factors prior to ICH is limited, understanding and controlling the modifiable risk is essential for prevention and better patient outcomes. So, furthermore, intracerebral hemorrhage can result in a range of serious complications. Seizures may occur at any time and can even be among the first signs of ICH, or intracerebral hemorrhage. Now, as the brain swells or bleeding continues, intracranial pressure increases. And this elevated pressure can reduce oxygen supply to the brain, potentially causing severe brain damage or death. In some cases, it may even lead to brain herniation, wherein the brain tissue is pushed into the spinal canal, which can be fatal. In addition to these life-threatening events, patients often experience functional deficits. So this may include difficulty speaking, weakness, or loss of movement on one side of the body. This also includes the loss of sensation and problems with thinking or attention. Now, other acute complications can include recurrent bleeding, infections, injury to cranial nerves, and coma. So, okay, for the epidemiology of the intracerebral hemorrhage, or ICH. So, ICH accounts for about 10 to 20% of all strokes worldwide. Its prevalence is higher in low and middle income countries, particularly in parts of Asia, where rates ranges from 18 to 24%. In contrast, Western countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia had reported lower rates of 8 to 15% approximately. The risk of ICH increases with age, especially in individuals over 80, making older age a strong predictor of mortality regardless of the stroke's severity. Women often experience more severe symptoms and are older when ICH first occurs compared to men. Now, certain ethnic groups also show higher rates of ICH. Like, for example, Black Americans and Mexican Americans have approximately 1.6 times higher incidence than white Americans. Similarly, Latin Americans, Native Americans, Japanese, Chinese populations experience higher occurrences. Now, these differences are influenced by multiple factors, like for example, the genetics. Genetics may predispose some populations to vascular problems, higher prevalence of hypertension, and other cardiovascular risk increases, which increases susceptibility. We also have lifestyle or socioeconomic factors, such as the diet, the physical activity, and access to healthcare, which can affect prevention and early treatment. Environmental and regional factors, like for example, high salt intake in some diets, also play a role. So, with all of this, understanding these demographic differences is important for targeting preventive strategies, improving blood pressure control, and ensuring timely interventions in populations at higher risk of ICH. Okay, so finally, let's discuss, or I will be discussing the pathophysiology of the intracerebral hemorrhage, or ICH. Now, it all begins by when a small blood vessel in the brain ruptures, and this allows blood to leak directly into the brain parenchyma, which is the tissue responsible for higher brain functions, like for example thinking, memory, and coordination, which is made up of neurons and supporting glial cells. So the immediate consequences of this bleeding is mechanical damage to the brain tissue. The leaking damage to the brain, the leaking blood creates swelling and increases intracranial pressure, which can compress surrounding structures. Almost instantly, a hematoma or localized blood clot forms at the site of the rupture. However, the damage does not stop there. Components of the hematoma, including red blood cells, hemoglobin, heme, iron ions, thrombin, and enzymes called matrix metalloproteinases, trigger secondary injury. So this leads to further neuronal damage and activates immune cells in the brain. One key process is called microglial polarization. So microglia are the brain's immune cells, and they can adopt different states. In the M1 or pro-inflammatory state, they release chemicals that worsen brain damage. In the M2 or anti-inflammatory state, they help repair tissue and support healing. So this balance between M1 and M2 responses is critical to how the brain reacts after ICH. In addition to microglia, other immune cells are drawn into the injury site. So together, these immune responses create a highly inflammatory environment. And at the same time, reactive oxygen species or ROS increases. ROS are harmful molecules that damage brain cells further. In short, the pathophysiology of ICH involves two major phases: the primary injury caused by the bleeding itself and the secondary injury driven by inflammation. Secondary injury driven by inflammation, also by immune cell activation and oxidative stress. So these processes explain why ICH can rapidly lead to serious neurological deficits and why early medical intervention is critical to limit the damage and improve patient outcomes.
The clear diet is a temporary and medically prescribed eating plan that allows only transparent fluids and foods that leave no residue in the gastrointestinal tract. It is designed to provide hydration, simple carbohydrates for minimal energy, and electrolytes while giving the digestive system time to rest and recover. This diet is typically introduced in situations where the body cannot tolerate regular food intake, such as before diagnostic tests, after surgeries, or during acute gastrointestinal problems. Because it is limited in nutrients, it is not intended for long-term use. Instead, it serves as a transitional diet either from NPO or nothing by mouth to more solid foods or when preparing the GI tracts for medical procedures. So the objectives of clear liquid diet are: first is to maintain adequate hydration. So clear liquids help replace fluid losses caused by vomiting, diarrhea, fever, or lack of oral intake. Next is to provide minimal caloric support. So although limited, clear liquids supply glucose through simple sugars to prevent weakness and hypoglycemia. Next is to allow the gastrointestinal tract to rest. So this diet reduces digestive activity and also irritation, giving time for healing and recovery. Next is to prepare the GI tract for diagnostic or surgical procedures. So this ensures that stomach and intestines remain empty, improving accuracy and safety during exams. And lastly, to prevent complications associated with early feeding. So this avoids nausea, vomiting, bloating, or aspiration in patients who are not yet ready for solid food. So for the aim of the clear liquid diet, so first is to keep the GI tract free from residue or undigested food since it prevents obstruction or interference with medical examination. Next is to avoid overstimulation of digestion since it allows bowel rest, especially in patients with inflammation or irritation. Next is to provide easy to digest nourishment since this diet is suitable for weak, nauseated, or post-operative patients. Next is to support gradual diet advancement since this serves as the first step before transitioning to full liquid, soft, or regular diets as tolerated. And lastly, to prevent dehydration and electrolyte imbalance since this diet ensures basic physiological needs are met even during restricted intake. So, for the definition of the diet, so a clear liquid diet is a strictly limited diet made up only of liquids that are transparent and liquid at room temperature. These foods leave no residue and are easily absorbed and are also gentle on the stomach. Examples include water, clear fruit juices without pulp, broths, and clear soups, plain gelatin, tea or coffee without milk or cream, electrolyte drinks, ice pops which are non-dairy, non-colored red or purple, and this diet excludes foods such as solid food, dairy products, opaque liquids like milk, smoothies or orange juice with pulp, soups with solids, and any food that is not fully transparent. So this diet is indicated for pre-operative or pre-procedural fasting, post-operative recovery, and the management of acute gastrointestinal symptoms such as nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. So the main purpose of this diet is to provide hydration and minimal calories while reducing stimulation of the digestive tract and ensuring an empty stomach or bowel for procedures like colonoscopy or imaging tests. This diet also helps rest the digestive system during severe gastrointestinal symptoms including inflammation, vomiting, and diarrhea. Additionally, it offers light nutrition while transitioning from fasting to surgery. Depending on the type of surgery, particularly those involving the digestive system, the diet may be required for several days to allow affected organs to recover, while others surgeries may only require a clear liquid diet for about 24 hours until the effects of anesthesia subside. So for the important considerations and reminders, so on this diet, there are some things to remember. First is, this type of diet should not be followed for more than a few days unless instructed by a healthcare professional because it doesn't contain enough calories, proteins, or nutritional values. The next is select only translucent liquids that are pulp-free and easy to digest such as broth, clear juices, gelatin, and electrolyte drinks while avoiding dairy products, any solid foods, or colored beverages since it can interfere with diagnostic studies. The next is monitor frequently for dehydration such as dizziness, dry mouth, or decreased urination, and increase fluids as necessary. The next is individuals with diabetes should choose sugar-free options and monitor their blood sugars regularly. And next is if one has problem swallowing, they might need thickened liquids for their safety. At all times, follow instructions provided about the timing of pre-procedure fasting in order to get accurate results and avoid complications. And lastly, immediately report worsening symptoms such as persistent vomiting, severe abdominal pain, or inability to keep fluids down. So lastly, for the complications of the diet, so a clear liquid diet is not nutritionally complete and cannot supply enough calories, protein, vitamins, or minerals, making it unsafe for long-term use. So prolonged intake may cause fatigue, weakness, nutrition, nutrient deficiencies, dehydration, and delayed healing. So this diet should only be followed as instructed by your healthcare professional. If prescribed before a test or procedures, follow the guidance exactly to avoid inaccurate results or the need to repeat the test. The next is people with diabetes face added risk because clear liquids often contain sugar and lack balanced nutrition. So, they should seek specific instructions from their healthcare provider, check blood glucose closely, and return to solid foods as soon as allowed. And overall, a clear liquid diet is helpful for short-term medical purposes, but improper or extended use increase the risk of nutritional and metabolic problems. So that's all for chapter 2 of the study.
So let's begin with chapter 3. First, we have the anthropometric data. For the patient's information, his name is Mr. GPB. He is a male and aged 32 years old. He is single in marital status and has a height of 5 foot and 3 inches or 160.02 centimeters tall and weighs 62 kilograms. For his medical history, for present illness and chief complaints, he is currently diagnosed with hypertension, a condition wherein the pressure inside the walls of the artery is consistently high and therefore requires more force to pump blood for circulation. His past illnesses, surgery, allergies, and hospitalizations. Before being rushed and admitted to the hospital, the client reportedly experienced dizziness and collapse in a very sudden and unanticipated manner. He was diagnosed with internal brain hemorrhage, specifically on his left hemisphere, and underwent a craniotomy, which is a major surgical procedure which involves the removal of a section of the skull to have access to the affected part of the brain and securing it back into place after the operation under the management and treatment of Dr. Ligutom. He was admitted to the ICU for a month at Zamboanga Peninsula Medical Center and he does not have any allergies. For his physical state of health, post-surgery, the client's right peripheries were paralyzed. He was non-ambulatory and was not able to talk. During his recovery, he gradually regained his sense of control and movement of his arms and legs. He underwent therapy and used crutches to walk. Currently, he is able to talk clearly and can walk a greater distance as compared to his recovery phase. His muscle weakness, specifically on the right side, has already recovered and has regained full control and range of movement. He engages in physical exercise by walking around the premises of their house every day. Overall, he is now fully recovered with good energy levels, physical state of health, and diet as tolerated. Now for the history of his parents' illnesses. The client's father has a history of diabetes mellitus type 2, a condition wherein the body is unable to produce or make use of insulin properly, resulting in persistently elevated or high blood sugar levels. His mother, however, does not have any history of illnesses relevant enough to affect his life and diet. Next, for his socio-economic background. For his ancestry or ethnic background, the family, including the client, is a Chavacano. Currently, 6 people live in the same household. The client, Mr. and Mrs. B, his sister's girlfriend, and a helper. However, there are only 4 of them that are directly related to each other, which is nuclear family, which includes him, both of his parents, and his sister. The client currently works as a retailer who buys and sells products to other clients. His highest educational attainment is second year college, having studied at Brent Hospital and Colleges Incorporated and the healthcare course. For his religion, the client is of Christian faith, with no food restrictions or particular cultural health practices being observed by the family or other practices or other than practicing the act of fasting during the Lenten season, wherein they avoid certain foods such as meat in accordance with their faith. For their type of residence, the client's family is currently living in Safar Street, Lumbangan Road, Divisoria, Zamboanga City, in a one-story single-family home in which they own as well as their lot. They are equipped with resources adequate enough for them to live comfortably, such as their water source, electricity, appliances, and internet. The family's combined income is 10,000 to 12,000 pesos, and the client earns up to 6,000 pesos as a retailer or in his buy and sell business. The client's recreational activities during his leisure time are singing in a video, okay? Watching television, and playing video games. He is not committed to any hobby. He has a moderate level of physical activity wherein he walks a few laps around their lot every day. Other activities include feeding the chicken and sweeping. Now, for his dietary history, food likes and dislikes. The client enjoys eating foods that are low in salt and fat. He prefers Filipino cuisine more than others. He likes eating meat, especially grilled fish and chicken, and eating fruits like mangoes. However, he dislikes eating vegetables. He prefers home cooked meals than fast foods or restaurants. His main source of carbohydrates is rice and likes eating bread as a snack. He does not eat any chips or junk foods and prefers light meals than heavy meals. Let's now move on to the client's typical food intake. During our interview, we asked the client to have a 24-hour food recall wherein he tried to remember what are the foods and drinks he consumed from the past 24 hours. And these are his answers. At 7 a.m., he ate breakfast at home and had 4 pieces of sliced bread, which was baked and he bought from Kirsten Bakery. The amount he ate was approximately 160 grams. Along with this, he also ate 1 slice of Eden cheese, wherein he put the cheese in one of the sliced breads, and the amount he ate was approximately 112 grams. And lastly, for breakfast, he also had 1 glass of mineral water, which is approximately 240 ml, in which he took from their water dispenser. At 9 a.m., he did not have any morning snacks. At 11 a.m., he ate lunch at home and had 2 cups of Princess Bea rice, which was boiled in a rice cooker, approximately 400 grams. For his Along with rice, he also ate one large serving of chicken leg quarter, which he bought from the market. It was fried with vegetable oil with a brand of UFC Happy Fiesta. This was approximately 320 grams. For his sauce, he had 1 cup of homemade white sauce. The preparation, his mother made this. She added flour to melted butter and mixed with milk. This was approximately 220 grams. And then lastly, he had 1.5 glass of mineral water, which is approximately 310 ml, in which he took again from their water dispenser. At 2 p.m., he ate his afternoon snack, which is one serving of Jollibee hamburger, which was bought and assembled and is approximately 132 grams. He also drank 1 glass of mineral water or 240 ml of water from their water dispenser. At 6 p.m., he and his family ate dinner at home, wherein he ate 1 cup of Princess Bea rice, which was boiled in the rice cooker for at approximately 200 grams. Along with rice, he ate one serving of fish, which they bought from the market, in which they grilled it at approximately 250 grams. For his vegetable, he also ate 5 slices of cucumber, which is 35 grams, and he drank 1 glass of mineral water, which is 240 ml, taken from their water dispenser. And lastly, for his late snack, he ate it at 10 p.m. at home, in which he had one piece of local cheese bread, which he bought and weighs approximately 50 grams. And he also drank 1 glass or 240 ml of mineral water taken from their water dispenser. So next we have frequency of meals and time eaten. According to the client, he eats 3 full meals and 3 snacks a day. He prefers home cooked meals and does not skip any of them. Usually, he eats breakfast at 7 a.m., lunch at 11 a.m., and dinner at 6:30 p.m. He eats his snacks at 9 a.m., 2 p.m., and 10 p.m. However, this may vary. He often eats bread and biscuits for snacks, along with Milo or Ensure as his hot drink. His meal times are consistent every day, and he eats together with his family. It takes him approximately 30 minutes to finish his meal, and he does not exceed 1 hour per meal. He drinks 8 glasses of water a day, and he likes drinking calamansi juice whenever he likes to. Or usually he drinks this juice during his PM snack at 2 p.m. He does not drink any soda or energy drinks as he avoids high sugar drinks and food. Next, for their cooking facilities, all their meals are cooked in a gas stove. They use rice cooker to cook rice and a fridge to store their food. They own an LPG or a gas tank as a source of fuel for cooking. And in case of any power interruptions, they also own a charcoal stove. They clean their cooking area and utensils every after meals and have a helper to assist them with meal preparation. The helper also assists with the cooking of the food. The primary cook of the family is the client's mother. The food waste disposal is segregated into trash bins, which are biodegradable and non biodegradable. They practice this as his mother works at a hospital. So she also implements this practice into their home for a more cleaner technique. For their food budget per person, their daily food budget is 200 pesos per person. They buy food from the wet market and prioritizes rice when their budget is limited. They buy groceries once a week and buys in small amounts instead of in bulk. Whenever they encounter financial difficulties and they cope by buying cheaper quality food products. They do not limit their number of meals per day when they have financial difficulties. Instead, they buy alternative sources, alternative products which are cheaper in quality. For their sources of nutrients, the client takes vitamins, specifically vitamin D and vitamin B complex. For additional nutrients, vitamin D helps support bone health and immune function, while vitamin B complex are crucial to convert food into energy, maintains nerve health, and supports metabolism. He does not have any past dietary restrictions prior to his surgical procedure. For his nutritional knowledge and where he obtained that knowledge, the client is fully aware of his diet and nutritional needs. His mother, who works in the dietary department in Zabong City Medical Center, and the doctor and nurses who manage his condition, provides him with nutritional guidance for him to maintain a healthy diet and nutrition. Now, for his past dietary needs while in the hospital, for his food likes and dislikes during his hospital stay, as according to the client, when he was prescribed clear liquid diet, he did not like it as he prefers solid foods. He dislikes hospital food when he transitioned to soft and full diet and often finds himself with no appetite because he primarily likes home cooked meals than other meals. For his present dietary prescription and rationale, the client was unconscious and was admitted to the ICU and placed under NGT for a month. He was nothing per order at the time, and after a month, he was prescribed clear liquid diet as a transitional diet for 1 day. Clear liquid diet is prescribed, but not limited to, patients who has undergone certain surgical procedures to allow the GI tract and digestive system to rest. Clear liquids digest easily and can help in the recovery process. It also prevents nausea and vomiting, which is a risk solid foods have. Besides the nutrients, it also provides adequate hydration, and this diet provides energy during the time that the patient cannot eat. Clear liquid diet is a transitional diet which gradually reintroduces soft and solid foods into the system and for the body to be able to adjust to the diet. He was then prescribed to liquid diet, soft diet, and then to full diet. At present or currently, his dietary prescription is diet as tolerated, which means he is now able to consume any food or drink he wants without causing any further complications. However, he was advised to avoid salty and fatty food. For his appetite, the client currently does not have any complications in chewing, swallowing, and eating in general. No complications were reported, including vomiting, cramps, nor abdominal distension. He is able to enjoy his meals to his delight. This indicates that his GI system is working properly and his body has adjusted to the diet and is fully recovered. He has a good appetite and finishes more than 75% of his meals. So, if we also ask the client if he has any physical handicap or any difficulties when he eats, according to the client, he currently does not have any physical handicap. He is physically healthy and has fully recovered from his condition. He can eat sitting upright and is able to perform his activities of daily living, and he is also capable of eating independently without any assistance or without any help in feeding. For his food tolerance, he is able to ingest any food and has no issues with food tolerance. He does not have any allergies to the food he eats. He is able to maintain a normal diet and can consume a wide variety of food products. However, he avoids eating salty and fatty foods to avoid his hypertension from worsening. Now for the need for dietary instructions. The client accordingly has received clear instructions on what he can or cannot eat. He has received these instructions from both the doctor and his mother, who is a worker at the dietary department. to ensure that he has fully understood his diet and for his guidance in choosing what to eat. Currently, he expresses no need for further dietary instructions or guidelines, as he is fully capable of controlling himself and choosing which foods to eat. He does not desire the need for nutrition counseling. Let us now proceed with the nutrition care process. For nutrition problem number one, nutrition assessment. Subjective cues, the client verbalized. Minsan, nagiging constipated ako at dati naman, pinapainom ako ng lactulose ng doktor. Tas nag-apursa talaga ako at that time para lang makabawas. Hindi rin kasi ako mahilig kumain ng mga pagkain like papaya nun. For the objective cues, as observed by the client, are infrequent, hard, dry, and strained bowel movement. On the actual interview, we weren't able to observe any objective cues because at that time, the client was not constipated. For the nutrition diagnosis, altered GI function related to inadequate fiber intake as evidenced by infrequent and hard bowel movement with straining. Now for the nutrition intervention. We have to provide nutrition education to the client on the importance of dietary fiber intake, promote high fiber food products for intake and natural laxative foods such as papaya and prunes, encourage adequate fluid intake, explaining that fiber needs fluid to work effectively to prevent fecal impaction, and then monitor bowel patterns regularly and adjust diet according to progress or status of the client's condition. So, the nutrition interventions are more focused on educating the client rather than the actions themselves. Because during the interview, the client was healthy, he was not constipated. So through education, we will be able to provide information to him in order for constipation not to happen again or to prevent constipation. Next, for nutrition monitoring and evaluation. Let's start with nutrition monitoring. We have to monitor the client's daily fiber and fluid intake, monitor for any changes in client's weight and BMI, monitor regularly for any abdominal distension because abdominal distension, this is one of the common symptoms, signs, the common signs of constipation. And then monitor the consistency of the stool and frequency of bowel movements. For nutrition evaluation, at the end of nutrition intervention, the client was able to understood the importance of dietary fibers and proper nutrition, increase intake of high fiber foods and fruits, and increase daily fluid intake. For the second nutrition problem, nutrition assessment subjective cues. The client verbalized, meron ako high blood sabi ng doktor kaya binigyan ako ng maintenance. The objective cues here are his latest blood pressure reading of 130 over 80 millimeters of mercury and his diagnosis of hypertension. For the nutrition diagnosis, excessive sodium intake related to frequent consumption of high-fat, high-sodium foods as evidenced by elevated blood pressure of 130 over 80 millimeters of mercury. For the nutrition intervention, we have to encourage the client to avoid high-fat and high-sodium foods such as processed and canned foods, which he is currently doing right now. He is avoiding high-fat and high-sodium foods. He is adhering to the low-fat, low-salt diet. Encourage the client to increase consumption of potassium-rich foods, promote adequate fiber intake, emphasize importance of proper adherence to medication, and encourage regular physical activity and exercise. So the reason why we need to encourage the client to increase consumption of potassium-rich foods is because potassium helps counteract sodium's effect on blood pressure. And we have to also promote adequate fiber intake because fiber supports blood pressure control and overall cardiovascular health. Regular physical activity and exercise also helps by removing excess fat from the body, which can also be the cause of his hypertension. For the nutrition monitoring and evaluation, nutrition monitoring. Monitor the client's blood pressure and blood pressure readings regularly, which he is currently doing. Monitor the client's daily diet and nutritional values. Monitor the client's heart rate regularly. And monitor the client's stress levels, sleep patterns, and weight, because these are also factors that can contribute to hypertension. For nutrition evaluation, at the end of nutrition intervention, the client was able to adhere to a low salt, low fat diet, increase daily fluid intake, understand the importance of medication and taking them as prescribed, maintain a stable blood pressure reading, and perform daily exercise and physical activity. And then for the last nutrition problem number 3, nutrition assessment. For the subjective cues, the client verbalized, bago ang operation ko, lagi yan ako puyat tapos nagiinom ng soft drinks. For the objective cues, puffed eyes or eye bags, and irregular sleep patterns. The reason why irregular sleep patterns is one of the objective cues because excessive intake of soft drinks or high sugar drinks can lead to excessive energy, which in turn can cause irregular sleep patterns. For a nutrition diagnosis, we have risk of excessive energy intake related to frequent consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. Nutrition intervention, we have to educate the client on the effects of excessive intake of soft drinks, promote healthier alternatives to replace soft drinks such as water or milk, encourage the client to limit caffeine and sugar intake, and encourage the client to establish a consistent sleep schedule. For nutrition monitoring, monitor the client's daily sugar and energy intake and adjust according to estimated daily needs. Monitor the client's sleep patterns and assess the client's energy levels regularly. For the evaluation, at the end of nutrition intervention, the client was able to understood the risks and effects of excessive sugar and soft drinks intake, replace soft drinks with healthier alternatives such as water, which is currently being adhered to by by the client because he avoids drinking soft drinks right now, and establish a consistent sleep schedule and adhere to it. So currently, the client only drinks water and milk or other drinks such as Milo, and he avoids drinking high sugar drinks such as soft drinks or Coke and Pepsi, which he used to drink always when he was still not yet diagnosed with hypertension. So that is all for chapter 3, and then let's now proceed to the next chapter.
So now I'll be presenting the chapter 4 of our case study. So I present a nutritional assessment based on the data of our client. Starting with the client's basic data, we have a 32-year-old individual with a current weight of 62 kg and a height of 5 feet and 3 inches. So the first crucial step in assessment is determining the desirable body weight or the DBW, which we calculated using the Tannhauser's method. So first, the height was converted to centimeters, resulting in 160.02 centimeters. Second, following the formula, we subtracted 100 from the height in centimeter, giving us 60.02 kilogram. Then finally, we adjusted this value by subtracting 10% of the initial weight to account for the client's current body frame, which led us to a final desirable body weight of 54 kilograms. Next, we move to classifying the client's current weight status using the body mass index or the BMI. So the BMI is calculated by taking the weight in kilogram divided by the square of height in meters. Then for our client, this calculation resulted in a BMI of 24.21, in which, looking at the BMI classification table, this BMI of 24.21 is within the range of 18.5 to 24.9, meaning that the client is classified as having a normal or healthy weight status. Now proceeding to the total energy requirement or the TER. So with the DBW now established, we can now determine the client's daily energy needs. So the TER per day is calculated by multiplying the client's DBW or the 54 kilogram by an energy coefficient based on their physical activity level. So the client's physical activity was assessed as moderate, which corresponds to 40 kilocalories per kilogram of DBW. So the multiplication gives us 54 kilogram times 40 kilocalories per kilogram, which results in a total energy requirement of 2,160 kilocalories. So for the purpose of simplified planning, we've rounded this to 2,150 kilocalories. Next is the nutrient distribution and food exchange. So this step is to distribute this total energy requirement among the major macronutrients and then translate it into a practical food exchange list. So based on the standard nutritional guidelines, the 2,150 kilocalories were distributed as follows. So the carbohydrates, they were allocated 65%, providing a 1,397.5 kilocalories or approximately 350 grams per day. While the proteins were allocated 15%, providing 322 kilocalories or approximately 80.6 grams per day. While the fats were allocated 20%, providing 430 kilocalories or approximately 47.8 grams per day. Now, for the food exchange list, so this section, it shows the composition of food needed for a 24-hour clear liquid diet. So the client's total energy requirement is 2,150 kilocalories per day. However, in the food exchange list that we calculated or we provided, it is only calculated for 1,060 kilocalories, which is approximately 50% of the TER. So the reason the client is only receiving half of their required calories is that this specific diet is clear liquid diet, which is medically prescribed temporary diet, and it is not a standard maintenance diet. So this list breaks down the total required nutrients into measurable food exchanges. So say for example, the plan includes 6 servings of vegetables, 10 servings of fruits, 4 servings of elf meat, and 20 servings of sugar to meet the 1,060 kilocalories requirement. So this demonstrates a practical approach to meal planning in case of the clear liquid diet. So we notice that the exchange groups for meat and fat, they have very low or even 0 servings. So this is because the most proteins and fat sources are solids like meat, oil or dairy, or cloudy liquids like milk, which is not allowed on a diet, especially on clear liquid diet, as they leave residue. So the bulk of the energy comes from the carbohydrate, primarily listed under fruits, milks, and sugar, which are easily absorbed. So the sugar exchange, the plan calls for 20 servings of sugar, which is crucial. So in a clear liquid diet, these sugars refers to simple, the clear carbohydrates like plain gelatin or sweetened gelatin, popsicles without pulp, or clear soft drinks, or electrolyte drinks like Gatorades, honey, or table sugars that are added to tea, as these items in the table are included to provide the 1,060 kilocalorie required for the basic needs, energy, and hydration. So there is a significant difference in the amount of carbohydrates, proteins, and especially fats between the full TER and the TER for the diet needed for the patient. So for carbohydrate, this difference is primarily complex or solid carbs like bread, rice, and fibrous vegetables, since this must be avoided in the clear liquid diet. Then protein is also significantly restricted or reduced due to the exclusion of meat, solid meats, or dairy. And the most restricted is the fats due to the exclusion of oil, cream, and full fat meats. So this table, it just we calculated or we provided, it just amounts to the 50% TER of the patient.
The total number of exchanges for the whole day is 40, distributed across the 5 feeding times, namely breakfast, morning snack, lunch, afternoon snack, and dinner. This distribution helps maintain adequate energy intake and prevent hypoglycemia while the patient is on a restricted diet. Now, for vegetables, a total of 6 exchanges are given, divided equally with 2 exchanges at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. These are provided in clear forms such as strained vegetable broth to supply minimal vitamins and minerals without adding fiber. Fruits account for 10 exchanges evenly distributed with 2 exchanges per meal and snack. These are usually in the form of clear fruit juices without the pulp, which mainly provide carbohydrates for energy. Rice exchanges, totaling 4 exchanges, are given during lunch, afternoon snack, and dinner, with the highest amount at dinner. Sugar exchanges make up the largest portion at 20 exchanges, distributed throughout the day with higher amounts during snacks and main meals. Sugar is emphasized in a clear liquid diet because it is the primary source of energy, helping meet caloric needs despite limited food choices. Now, for milk, meat, and fat, these exchanges are not included in this plan because these foods are not allowed in a strictly clear liquid diet due to their complexity and potential to stimulate digestion. Overall, the exchange distribution ensures that the patient receives frequent small amounts of carbohydrates throughout the day. To better understand those exchanges, we have a sample menu. For breakfast, we have 1 bowl of hibachi soup, only the broth, and 1 glass of orange Gatorade. For morning snack, we have 1 glass apple juice, 1 cup of sweetened gelatin, and a piece of watermelon ice pop. For lunch, we have 2 bowls of vegetable soup, only the broth, 1 cup of lemon juice, and a piece of orange ice pop. For afternoon snack, we have 1 bowl of chicken sinigang, only the broth, 1 can of Diet Coke, and 1 piece of mango ice pop. Finally, for dinner, we have 2 bowls of fish bouillon, only the broth, 1 cup mango juice, and 1 piece of strawberry ice pop. Now, in preparing the hibachi soup, the ingredients for it include 2 cups of chicken broth, 1 cup of carrots, thinly sliced carrots, 1 cup of chopped celery, 1 cup of sliced onions, 1 cup of mushrooms, as well as 1 cup of chopped green onions. Now, for the first step, we will have to pour all the ingredients into a pot, then bring the mixture to a rolling boil. Once boiling, lower the heat to a gentle simmer and let it cook for at least 30 minutes. After 30 minutes has passed, strain the soup in a strainer to separate the broth from the vegetables, as only the broth will be eaten. Then the broth goes back into the pot and add 2 extra cups of water. Pour the hot broth into the bowl and now it's ready to be served.
To conclude, the post-operative management of a patient who has undergone a craniotomy requires careful consideration of all factors that may affect recovery, and this includes nutritional management. In this case, the implementation of a clear liquid diet served as a safe and appropriate initial dietary intervention during the early post-operative period. Given the patient's neurological status and the possible effects of anesthesia and medications, introducing a diet that minimizes gastrointestinal stress was essential to prevent complications such as aspiration, nausea, and vomiting. The clear liquid diet allowed for adequate hydration while also providing a means to assess the patient's tolerance to oral intake. This step was important in ensuring that the patient could safely progress toward normal feeding without compromising neurological stability. As the patient demonstrated improvement in strength, consciousness, and functional abilities, the gradual advancement of diet supported continued recovery and healing. So overall, this case highlights the importance of recognizing diet as an integral component of post-operative nursing rather than just a routine task. The appropriate use of a clear liquid diet following craniotomy promoted safe nutritional progression, supported the patient's metabolic needs, and helped prevent delays in recovery. Through evidence-based dietary management and continuous nursing assessment, optimal patient outcomes following major neurological procedures can be achieved.
Now, for our recommendation, diet and duration of and purpose. The patient's dietary education plan focuses on providing clear and comprehensive guidance to ensure safe and adherence to the prescribed clear liquid diet. The patient was informed about the expected duration of the diet to set realistic expectations and to prepare for the gradual transition back to the regular diet. Understanding the time frame of the diet supports compliance and helps the patients to anticipate the return to normal nutritional intake. Now, transition to regular diet. After completion of clear liquid phase, the patient will receive structured instructions on the gradual reintegration of balanced diet. Nutrients-dense food will be introduced slowly to restore adequate caloric intake and meet daily nutritional needs. This stepwise approach supports digestive adjustments, minimize gastrointestinal discomfort, and promotes overall recovery. Maintaining nutrition during clear liquid diet. To maintain adequate nutrition during the clear liquid diet, the patient is encouraged to consume a variety of permitted liquids. These include clear broths, herbal teas, diluted fruit juice, and electrolyte containing beverages, which support hydration and provide limited mineral intake, offering variety within dietary restrictions, improves acceptability, and helps meet essential physiological needs. For now, our nutritional assessment and supplementation, the patient's nutritional status will be assessed regularly to determine the need for supplementation. Vitamins or minerals may be prescribed if deficiency are identified. Collaboration with registered dietitian is recommended to individualize supplementation based on the patient's specific nutritional requirements. Now, for our limitation of sugar-rich liquids, the patient was educated on limiting the intake of sugar-rich clear liquid due to their low nutritional value and potential to cause blood glucose fluctuations. Education emphasized the metabolic effects of excessive sugar consumptions and encouraged healthier clear liquid alternatives that supports dietary goals and glycemic stability. Hydration management. Maintaining adequate hydration throughout the clear liquid diet was emphasized. The patient was instructed to consume small, frequent amount of clear liquid and to monitor urine color as an indicator of hydration status. Proper hydration was reinforced as an essential for comfort, recovery, and overall well-being. Lastly, for our ongoing monitoring and safety, systematic monitoring of nutritional levels will be conducted throughout the duration of the clear liquid diet. Ongoing assessments allow for early identification of nutritional deficiency and timely adjustment to dietary plans, supplementation. This proactive approach ensures patient safety, nutritional adequacy, and effective dietary management.